everybody. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I am Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are very, very welcome to our YouTube coverage content channel today, all the C's. If you don't know, we're two doctors. That's why we call ourselves the Good Doctors. We have social science degrees that taught us a lot about curiosity and empathy, so much so that we now believe those two things in combination can change the world. We showcase this and our belief in this through various ways and lots of discussions about all kinds of culture, popped and lived. We love to talk about sassy romance drama on Bridgerton and what it has to say, believe it or not, about diversity and race and sex and all those kinds of things. We love to do one-off documentary reviews, like when we talk about Pride Month and some of the more important things you should know about, sex abuse scandals in USA gymnastics. We just run the whole darn gamut. We love to talk to each other. We do it so much it's obscene, but we actually love to talk to other humans too, which is why we have these services. Please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, do the YouTubey things so that we can engage with you on all of these fascinating topics.
Today's video is the second stop this week in the Stop on Colonizers World Tour. I'm going to keep workshopping that, guys. I don't love it. But basically, we spend a couple months every year investigating how colonization has affected every country around the world, because P.S., there's only one that it hasn't affected. Antarctica. In some way, shape, or form. Everyone is either a colonizer, has been colonized, or is both. Mm-hmm. And we don't quite have a good conversation internationally about it, so we're doing our part. This week, we've been talking about a place that up to this week, neither one of us could have found on a map for you. And we're talking about French Guiana, which is part of France. It is still like a colony, and it uses the euro, the whole nine. But the reason it's still part of France, if we're honest, when it probably could have gotten amalgamated into some other things around the time, is that it was a penal colony for them for a long ass time. And in 1995, the BBC did a great documentary, as the BBC oft does, a great 1 hour documentary that now is, thank you, copyright laws on the YouTubes, that we could watch and experience. So they called it Devil's Island because because it was hell, and only 10% of people that were sent there actually finished their sentences, not because they were set free. Not a great look for France or humanity. But here's the deal. I don't know anything about imprisonment to the level like I have but a pea's worth of knowledge based on my dear beloved partner, whose PhD actually was in identity formation whilst one is in prison. So I am going to kind of turn this over and sit here and learn along with the rest of you. This is one of the documentaries that I wish we had been in the same room together to watch, because I would have listening to Erin respond would have taught me more. Because there was a couple times where I was like, is this normal? What's going on? I'll just have Erin talk about it. So Erin.
Yeah, Kristen.
Thoughts and feelings. Get us started. I
would love to share. It just reminds me, it's like whenever something religious comes up on The Handmaid's Tale, I just write in my notes, ask Kay.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I don't know. It's not my bag. This is my bag, incarceration specifically. And what was so interesting to me about this, I've not really explored penal colonies that much in my studies of incarceration. I know vaguely a little bit about the Australian penal colony, just because we lived on the island of Ireland and in the UK for 5 years. But my experience is a lot more with a different form of politicized imprisonment and internment. So I really kind of relished the opportunity to dive into this. I relatively trust the BBC in its accuracy, also from 1995, but I'm telling y'all, this is all we could find on French Guiana. But as I said in our 101 video, the several reasons why France decides to turn Guiana into a penal colony. One, it used to be a slave outpost, and then they abolished slavery. So they had this land strategically in South America, near Haiti, also a colonial property. And they were like, this is a good idea to keep it, but like, we can't have slaves anymore. So what are we going to do? around this time and the time of the French Revolution, we started to see a global evolution in the changing ideas of what it meant to punish someone. And I had so many flashbacks to Foucault and discussions of punishment. Foucault is a French theorist who we all had to study at some point for his apparent great impact in the disciplines. I'm kidding. But he also wrote a lot about incarceration and forms of punishment. So after the revolution, this changes. We literally have some French delegates go visit the Eastern State Penitentiary, which is in Philadelphia, outside Philadelphia. Hey.
Also, eventually where Al Capone was, and you can now do tours in Al Capone's cell.
Yeah, that needs to be on our list if it's open again now with the COVID.
Oh, it totally is. I just refuse to go during Halloween and the ghost tours, but we can go.
Yeah. Obviously I love to tour prisons. They're fascinating. But they learn a lot.
I love to hold snacks for you while we do it.
They learn a lot from Eastern State and this idea and evolution of kind of constant observation, which is called the Panopticon. And so that's why you start to see Victorian era prisons become like kind of tentacles out.
They're like wagon wheels. They're literally based.
Yeah.
The guy who came up with it is named Jeremy Bentham, and he got the idea from watching a wagon wheel. So
yes.
Yeah.
You know about prisons. So yes, Benthamian theory of incarceration becomes one of observation and control, less so focused on punishment, more focused on rehabilitation. And there's
hypothetical
rehabilitation through usually forced labor.
Yeah, because what we get at this time, I can bring the religion into this. What we get at this time is the Church of England really teaching about that prisoners were essentially just deep sinners.
Yeah.
And so that if they could do penance in a way like this, I mean, really, that's what, like, when I was reading even the Wikipedia article about Devil's Island, there was a lot of talk about this being people's physical penance for their crimes against the state, the church, and the people of France. So that's one of the reasons you get this shift, is a shift in public theology, because even if things are not state churches, and even if you think it's bullshit, religion really matters as you look at the history of the world and how things move. So this was a real Victorian kick on everyone's a sinner. Original sin became a real big deal in this thing.
Yeah, and if you, like, the more of a sinner you are, like the bigger sinner you are, it like drives you to crime.
Correct. And it becomes a stain on your family.
Yeah.
And your like generations if you don't work it off. Hence also this forced labor. It's physical penance, whereas Catholicism is prayed penance. So when they put the forced labor into it, but it was all about the redemption of souls. I know that sounds nuts to you guys, but like they really did think this would work.
Yes, they did. And what's really interesting about the French development of this is they thought it would work, but they also didn't want them in their overcrowded French jails. So those two things combined made them take a second look at their overseas possession of Guiana, and they decided to start sending them to French Guiana and establish a penal colony there. Conditions were very different from the jails in metropolitan Paris. They worked in the fields and in the houses. It was not the solitary confinement of French prisons. Don't let any of that convince you that it was a nice time for any of them. What I found fascinating, and one of the reasons why only 10% of the population survived, besides the conditions being far from home, not having any resources, and lots of diseases, was that the French passed a law called the law of doubling, where if you served less than 8 years, if you were sentenced less than 8 years, you had to stay and work still after your sentence was over in the penal colony for the equivalent number of years of your sentence. So if you were sentenced to 6 years, you had to serve 6 years, and then you had to stay and be a laborer, a libéré as they were called, for another 6 years before you could return to France. And, this left them constantly impoverished and under-resourced, and so most of them never returned to France. If you served more than 8 years, you could never return to France. So basically, France was like, we don't want you back. We're going to make as many laws so that you can't come infect our society with your sinning.
And so also your random tropical diseases we do not understand and believe is part of the curse of God.
Yes. So they had varying hierarchies in terms of treatment. They had logging camps along the river, which were used for repeat offenders. The purpose, as is often the purpose, even with benevolent or rehabilitative incarceration, is to dehumanize. They died from conditions, they died from disease, they died from depression and isolation, and homesickness. All of those impacted on them. The worst of the offenders were sent to the Ile du Salut, and the Devil's Island, the Ile du Diable, was part of the Ile du Salut compound, and was reserved for political detainees. So lest you think they were just sending ordinary decent criminals, oh Lord, no. There was still politics in France, and they still wanted to get rid of their political opponents. So they sent them to Devil's Island. We learn a lot about Devil's Island through the high-profile case of Alfred Dreyfus, who brought international attention as onto Devil's Island as a stand-in for the whole penal colony. It's a really complicated story of what happened to these humans, men. We have a lot of letters that they wrote, or journals or diaries that they wrote, describing the conditions and what that isolation was like. The mortality rate was 70%, and bodies were just thrown into the sea because there wasn't any space for a convict graveyard in the land that they had in French Guiana. And French authorities, obviously knew what was happening in French Guiana in the penal colony. They didn't want anybody else to know, and they managed to conceal it until 1923, when a rather adept press officer who had some connections got a visitor pass and traveled to French Guiana. He then published a lot about it, including a letter directly to the minister involved in operating the prison, saying, "It's not reforms they need in Guiana, Mr. Minister, it's a revolution." So enough public pressure and disgust that a penal colony still existed in the 20th century put enough pressure on the French that they eventually released the men from service, the libérés. But you know what? They had nowhere to go, and they had no jobs. So even if they were released while the penal colony was still in operation, they reoffended so that they could have a roof over their head sometimes, or a meal. This is very common in incarcerated folks when there is no policy or project for re-entry into society. We've seen it in my oft-cited The Shawshank Redemption, where a lot of people become so accustomed to the culture of incarceration, they don't have any skills, they cannot engage in society in a meaningful way, and they are not given any support to do so. All they know is prison life, and so they do something to get them sent back there. We get to see the Salvation Army, shout out to the Salvation Army, show up towards the end here and decided we're going to help repatriate some of these libérés to France. But same situation, different part of the world. They had no resources, no support, no money. They came home with no skills. Horrible statistic the documentary gives us: of the 4,000 people the Salvation Army helped repatriate, 1/3 were dead within a year arriving in France. And so it's a kind of a treatise on what a penal colony is and how we think about incarcerated folks as being somewhere in between living and dead people.
Yeah.
And that they exist in this othered space, very often hidden away so that society can't see and or interact with them, so they don't know. This is both for the benefit of the power in charge, because they don't want to be held accountable, and also under the belief system that like removing people from the society is the best way.
Yeah.
Both for them and for us. So it was a harrowing journey to Devil's Island, made all the better by the fantastic narration of Scotland's own Bill Patterson.
Very true.
Which I did not, I recognized his voice. And then thankfully someone in the YouTube comments was like, hey, it's Ned from Outlander. And I was like, it is. His dulcet tones and lovely French pronunciation aside, it's about 48 minutes long. It's well worth a watch, especially if you're interested in any of the things we just talked about.
There's also a 2016, I think, movie. So when you Google Devil's Island or you Google French Guiana, what's going to come up is Papillon, which is a 1953 original movie.
Yeah, because it's based on a book.
Yeah.
That was set in Devil's Island. Yeah.
And there was a remake with Charlie Hunnam from both The Sons of Anarchy and Pacific Rim.
Oh, yeah. And Academy Award winner Rami Malek.
The reviews are terrible, both from a production standpoint and also a historical accuracy standpoint. Everyone's like, do not watch this movie. So we're going to.
Which, of course, I was about to say, which you guys know means we're going to watch it and then we're going to tell you all about it.
And we're going to tell you all about it. We probably will go live about it. Either on YouTube or Instagram, and talk about why just sometimes because you can make something doesn't mean you should. And it's gonna be a time. It's gonna be a time. But I think that's all we've got for Devil's Island. What I would say from a non-incarceration specialist perspective is that what really this documentary drove home, even more than some other documentaries about incarcerated folks that I've seen, was the innate denial of humanity.
Yeah.
In a way that by using, I think in a lot of other documentaries I've watched about incarcerated folks focuses on one person, and that's great and powerful. But because this focused on the system, we heard so many voices.
Yeah.
And so many voices all telling the same story was, to me, fresh in an impactful way that I hadn't experienced in a little while. Yeah. Honestly, since I was pseudo researching Erin's PhD the same way she pseudo researched mine, because we know the entire paragraphs of each other's doctorates essentially. Yeah. And that's the last time I thought about the breadth of incarceration in this way, honestly. So I'm really, really glad I saw it.
Me too.
I'm glad I know that there's a country called French Guiana.
Me too. Same.
And next week, we're heading somewhere that we both already knew existed, we'll completely admit, but also didn't know a whole lot about, despite the fact that one of my best friends lived there for a little while. Yeah. We're going to head to Cameroon.
Which in Africa.
Is, a fascinating place. Also, and we'll talk about this a little bit next week, but just as you're watching this, it's a country that's changed a lot in the last couple of years in terms of the level of tension. So we're going to be very careful to talk about what year we're talking about in a certain way, which we haven't had to be in a little while. So know that we're keeping an eye on that. And we hope that you join us for that coverage of Cameroon. In the meantime, if you loved this video or you love any video or you like French Guiana, please do all the YouTube-y things and subscribe, comment, tell us what's going on. We love to talk, as we said at the beginning, to you. And also it just really helps the algorithm and we'd real appreciate it. So from the good doctors to you, have a great week and we'll see you in Cameroon.
Take care, everybody.